Right, we'll get started with some introductions of the topic and everything while we're still waiting for our last few folks to join us today. So hi, I'm probably a familiar face for those of you who might have been joining LogicPrep webinars for the last couple of years. My name is Olivia. I'm one of our college advisors, and I also am our Director of Content and Narrative, so I help to run all of the glorious webinars that we put on with all of our amazing staff members. So today I'm joined by Lindsay and Gretchen, and we're going to be talking about the state of college admissions in 2024. We run this webinar every year in August as a way to update everyone about new things that are happening in the college admission process, no matter where they might be coming from. So this year in particular, we've seen a lot of changes to the SAT and ACT testing space, shifts in test policy, and also a lot of conversation around the value of starting early and what that means in the college admission process. So those are the main topics we're going to be covering today, and we're going to kind of go through them one piece at a time so you can see all of these new things that are going on and how that might affect you, whether you're applying this year or next year or even further down the line. So a little bit more about each of us. As I said, my name is Olivia. I work on our college advising team here. I'm a former admissions officer myself, so I've spent several years reading many thousands of college applications from students just like you. And so I bring a lot of that expertise into this process to help our students figure out not only where they want to apply, but how they can best position themselves to be successful at the universities of their choice. I'm going to pass it off to Gretchen to introduce herself next.
Thanks, Olivia. I'm Gretchen. I'm the academic director here at LogicPrep, so kind of in charge of all things tutoring, whether test prep or school support. And my background is in tutoring. I've been with LogicPrep for about 10 years now. So started out as a tutor and now get to wear a bunch of different hats. And I'll pass it off to Lindsay.
Hi, I'm Lindsay. I'm our founder and CEO. I started LogicPrep over a decade ago now. My background is in writing and literature, and really my interest in storytelling underlies our whole approach to advising students. As many of you know, I now help students to tell their stories through the classes they take, the activities they pursue, and the essays that they write. And I'm lucky to be surrounded by such an extraordinary team of advisors and tutors to help support students in their journeys. So with all that said, I just want to preface this presentation by saying that we have a number of topics to discuss with different implications for the college admissions process. And with that said, I want to underscore, we'll speak about the many changes that we're observing. Fundamentally, the things that have always mattered to this process still matter. And I really want to make sure that that's clear, that academic success in the form of strong grades and potentially test scores, as we'll talk about, finding an appropriate college fit, and crafting a genuine and compelling personal narrative. So with all of that said, Olivia is going to walk us through some of the big topics or changes that we're going to cover, and then we will get to it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lindsay. I think that's such a great overview for everyone to really kind of approach this presentation with that mindset. So here's what we're going to be discussing specifically today for this year's update. We're going to be talking first and foremost about changes to the SAT and ACT. Gretchen will lead us through all of that with all of her insight that she has into how the tests are changing and have changed in recent years. We'll also be talking about the return to test requirements. Those of you who follow a lot of colleges on social media or follow college news have probably noticed quite a number of highly selective universities returning to requiring testing this year. We're going to talk about who's doing it and why and what that means for you. We'll also talk about how that might affect how you manage your testing process and how you make decisions around testing, both with your college advisor and with your academic advisor. And then Lindsay's going to talk us through the value of an early start, kind of exactly what we were talking about, what matters in the admission process, both now and also always, right? And how do we help students achieve those things? And then lastly, we'll just talk through our final takeaways and kind of wrap it all up for you, since it's a lot of different topics, so that you can leave with a really strong understanding of what's going to be important for you to think about going forward. So Gretchen, go ahead and get us started with changes to the SAT and ACT.
Thanks, Olivia. Yeah, so we wanted to start today by going over some of the recent changes that have happened and upcoming changes, because both are really going on with the SAT and the ACT. As many of you know, the SAT and the PSAT, along with it, have undergone some major changes in the past couple of years, and the ACT is about to follow suit with some of those. So to start out, I wanted to recap what's been going on with the SAT. It has recently changed from a traditional paper-based test to a computer adaptive test. This happened internationally starting in 2023, and then within the US starting at the beginning of this year. And what this means is that the test adjusts in difficulty as it goes based on your performance on the test thus far. So if you're doing well, you're going to start to get harder questions. If you're not doing as well, you're going to start to get easier questions. And at face value, that feels a little sketchy to a lot of people because not everyone is seeing the same set of test questions. So it doesn't necessarily have that underlying feeling of fairness, but there's actually a lot of science supporting the validity of adaptive tests, and many other tests have been adaptive for quite a number of years, like the GRE and the GMAT. If any of your parents have taken those have been adaptive since like the 90s. So the main benefit of adaptive testing is that it allows tests to be shorter, which is a nicer test experience for a lot of students. And essentially how this works is that if you're a really strong student, you're not wasting a ton of time with easy questions that the test can essentially assume you're going to get right. It's just not going to give them to you. And if you're a little bit of a weaker student, they're not going to throw you really, really difficult questions that A, would maybe be a waste of your time, and B, would kind of intimidate you and make you feel stressed during the test. The way that the SAT works in terms of its adaptive nature is that it's adaptive by section or by module, not by question. And so that means a couple of things. It doesn't, as you go through, rather than responding to every single answer that you give and getting harder or easier after every single question, it only does that at like 2 major points in the test. So you have a first verbal module. Depending on your performance there, it gets either harder or easier for the second module, and then repeats for the math section as well. And this has a couple of benefits. One is that you're not in your head about, oh my gosh, am I in the hard module, or am I getting harder questions or easier questions every single time you see a new question? And the other thing that means that you can skip questions and go back to them within that same module, whereas if it was adaptive by question, you wouldn't be able to. So what have students been saying? This has been the case, or this has been the test in the format that it's in for a while now internationally, and for March, May, June, August, 4 administrations now in the US. And feedback so far from students is that they kind of like the format of it. It's simultaneously shorter than the SAT or the ACT, and it gives you more time per question, which is really nice. There's no long passages on it, so no 2 columns of text that take up a whole page, and then you have to answer 10 questions related to it. And there's a Desmos on-screen calculator that is really quite a powerful tool, especially if you have a little bit of coaching to know how to take full advantage of it. This does come with some caveats, though. It's not, even though it feels like an easier test, it's not necessarily an easier test to score well on. Because it's not rushed, because you're not exhausted by the end of it, and perhaps because you're not getting thrown those difficult questions, it doesn't necessarily feel as hard as the ACT does, but that really doesn't automatically translate to higher scores. The test is still designed to differentiate students based on their differing abilities. That's kind of why the colleges want to use these tests to begin with. And in fact, in our experience with the digital SAT thus far, at least with the US students in these first 3 administrations that we've gotten scores back from, it seems particularly difficult for students to get north of 1,500. So strong students that are wanting to get those tippy top scores, especially in comparison to how difficult it seems to get into those similar scoring ranges of like a 34 or a 35 on the ACT. So feels like a really attractive test. There are caveats to it. So ACT, since the SAT and the ACT are in competition, it's coming up with its own changes. And going forward, the ACT is positioning itself as the test of choice. So it's not forcing you to take it on a computer, but you can if you want to. At least within the United States. Sorry, international students, you guys are all taking it on the computer, and it's going to stay that way. But within the US, that's already been the case for quite a while. You can either sign up for a digital test or a paper test. And up until now, there's really been no benefit of taking it digitally. So we just encourage students to take it on paper. Going forward, though, not only will you be able to choose whether or not to take it on paper, but you'll also be able to choose whether or not to do the science section. which is really big. A lot of students don't love that section. In addition to that, they are going to be shortening the test. So of the 3 core sections, the English, math, and reading, they're removing 44 questions and a little bit of time as well, so that you have a little bit more time per question and you don't have as many questions to do. Again, caveat, in this case, and this is a conversation I've had with a lot of rising juniors recently, these changes aren't happening immediately. So in April, this will roll out for all students who are in the US and taking the test on the computer. So if you're a paper-based test taker, you will not have the option to opt out of the science in April. Or if you're international, that's not going to happen until September of next year, which is quite a while away. And then spring of 2026 is when this is going to roll out for school day testing, but I think most of you guys are taking on the weekend anyway. The last little caveat that I'll maybe plant a seed here for, and maybe Olivia or Lindsay, you can share your estimation as to where this might be going to, is whether colleges have a preference for the SAT or the ACT science or not. So in the past and still currently, the ACT has an optional writing section. Nowadays, no one requires the optional writing section. So we basically say, don't take it to all of our students, but that wasn't always the case. A handful of years ago, it was required by some schools. And so for a long time, our recommendation was take the ACT with writing just in case you need it. And I think it's a little bit TBD if that's going to be the case with the science. It might depend maybe if you're going to go into a STEM major or not, but it's just something to keep in mind when you're starting out your journey, that you don't necessarily know what's going to be required at the end of it.
Yeah, at the moment, things feel very TBD as far as what colleges are going to require, since these changes were just announced about a month ago. So I'm imagining, universities tend to move rather slowly with things. And so I'm imagining that a lot of admissions offices right now are sitting down together and talking about, what are we going to do about this new version of the ACT? What do we want to require or recommend from our applicants? How do we want to shift our requirements, and how do we want to explain that decision to our applicants? So I would imagine all of those conversations are happening right now. We don't know when colleges are going to actually come out with those announcements, though. So that's definitely something that we are all keeping an eye on, so that we can let you all know as soon as we know more. But especially for our students who are looking to start test prep maybe this fall or this coming spring, that's going to be an important thing for you to consider. And I also want to encourage you all, if you have specific schools in mind, ask them. You are able to communicate directly with admission offices, and you are able to, ask those questions of the schools that you are specifically curious about and interested in. And they'll tell you, whether they've made a decision or not, or what they're hoping to get from their students. So definitely try to be proactive with the colleges you're interested in.
So thank you, Olivia. All this is to say is that it's not a one size fits all. There are pros and cons to both the SAT and the ACT. So we still encourage students, and Olivia, I think we'll talk about this a little bit too, to try them both out. We always start with a diagnostic process where you take a couple of intro lessons, take a practice SAT, take a practice ACT, find out what's the better fit for you. And I think Olivia is going to now talk a little bit about what role these tests even play in the admissions process these days.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Gretchen. So these two things really tie in well together, right? There's been a lot of changes to the tests lately. There have also been a lot of changes to how colleges are using the tests in admission evaluation. So any of you who have been following the college admissions world over the last couple of years will know that during the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, a lot of colleges went test optional who had never been test optional before. They had always required either the SAT or the ACT in order to apply for admission. And that standard pretty much went out the window with COVID. In the last few years, what we've been observing is the continuing shift of the aftermath of that decision. And this year in particular, in 2024, what's new is that we've seen many highly selective colleges actually returning to that test requirement. So this is a shift from the last couple of years, because a lot of these colleges were saying in 2022, in 2023, that we intend to remain test optional for the foreseeable future. We're still evaluating. We don't know yet. Columbia University even made a commitment to say, yes, we are going to be test optional permanently. So everything seemed to be pointing more in the direction of test optional staying, even at the highest levels of US colleges and universities. This year, what we're starting to see is things are moving back a little bit more. So just this year, we have a number of universities that have announced in 2024 for applicants that are applying right now: Brown, Caltech, Dartmouth, Harvard, UT Austin, and Yale are all requiring test scores. So any of you who might be rising seniors this year, if you are planning to apply to any of these colleges, you do have to submit either an SAT or an ACT test score. These colleges were all announced back in winter and early spring. So I think they were making those announcements with the hope that students would have time to take an SAT or ACT before applying. If you want to apply to one of these schools and you have not taken an SAT or ACT, please schedule one as soon as possible. And if you want support for that and you want to prep for it, please contact us and we can help you set that up. It's going to be really important to make sure that you have that for these schools. In addition, we're also seeing a list of schools that are announcing now that they will be starting to require tests again in 2025. As of right now, that list includes Cornell, Johns Hopkins, and Stanford University. So these colleges are not requiring testing for students that are applying this year, but they will start requiring it for students applying next year. So these colleges are trying to give students a little bit more lead time to say, hey, if you want to apply, if you want to apply in the next year, you are going to need testing. So it's nice that you have a little bit more lead time of knowing that testing will be required. However, again, for those who are applying this year, what this is telling you about the college admission process is that they value test scores and that they see this as an important part of the process. So you can apply to Cornell without a test score this year. You can apply to Johns Hopkins or Stanford without a test score this year, but it's not advisable. All of these schools are saying that they highly encourage students to submit testing if at all possible. So again, if you haven't prepared for this in advance, please make every effort to get a test score that you're proud of that you can send off with your application, because that's only going to help you in the admission process. This is not to say that these three universities are never going to admit anyone without testing this year. I'm sure they will. But they are demonstrating to us that this is an important piece for them. So that's something to keep in mind. And then I just want to highlight, for those of you who may not have been following this very closely the last couple of years, that these schools are joining a group of colleges that already have returned to testing requirements, either in 2022 or 2023. That list is a lot longer than what we have showing here, but these are the ones that are most commonly applied to by our students. So that includes Georgetown, MIT, Purdue, Florida, and the majority of Florida and Georgia public universities. So those are places like the University of Florida or Georgia State or that kind of thing. Georgia Tech is part of that list as well. So that's where the policies already exist. And then we have this new group of colleges that are just announcing this year they're returning to testing. I want to talk a little bit about why they're returning to testing. So the main theme that we're seeing across the board is that for a lot of these colleges, these are some of the most selective institutions in the United States, which means the vast majority of them are seeing, 80,000, 90,000, 100,000 applications in a year. And they are really trying to split hairs as far as deciding who is going to get the yes and who is not. And so for colleges that have to do these infinitesimal, tiny decision-making around their applicants, having a test score can really bring a lot of information to that process. And so that's why we're seeing this change happen here. And a lot of these colleges are also really focusing on access for students that are coming from high schools that they don't know as well, from parts of the US or parts of the world that they don't know as well. And if the only academic information you have is a transcript from a high school that you don't know, with a curriculum that you don't know, or from a country that you don't really know, that can make it really hard for admissions people to evaluate is the student really ready to take on the rigor of an education at Brown or at Harvard? And so that's where they're seeing a lot of value in having the test score as a more standardized metric to say, okay, this student who's applying from this high school and this curriculum that we don't really understand has a really strong test score, which means they must be, you know, really well prepared for this type of education. So those are the reasoning that they're talking about when they're returning to these test requirements. Now, I don't want to scare everybody because there are still over 1,400 colleges and universities in the US that are test optional or test free, which means they don't take testing at all indefinitely. So these are colleges that have committed to an indefinite, you know, a number of years of being test optional and accepting applicants from students without testing. So just because there's this small subset of very highly selective universities that are requiring testing from applicants now, that does not mean that everybody needs to have testing all the time in order to be a good candidate. There are so many colleges and universities out there that are remaining test optional, that are committed to being test optional, and where you certainly can apply and be successful without test scores. So please keep that in mind. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that plays into your testing process as well. So a lot of the questions that we've been getting the last few years, basically since the pandemic, is do I test or do I not test? Do I try? Do I not try? How should I spend my time, right? And our first response to this always is that standardized testing is still additive for most applicants, but not necessarily for all applicants. So, you know, as I was saying, right, there are a lot of colleges that you may want to apply to that are requiring tests. If you're going to apply to one of those schools, you have to have testing. Even for colleges that don't require testing, though, it's often a great way to showcase your academic abilities and your preparedness for the type of rigorous education that those colleges provide. So even if it's optional, it's still usually a good idea for most applicants. That being said, we also work with students who consider themselves to be not strong testers. Maybe they, you know, philosophically just don't believe in what standardized testing is about. I've worked with students that have those beliefs, and they have also been successful in the admission process, and they've been able to find colleges that they're really excited about through this. So if that's you, if you feel like you're not a strong tester, if you feel like you simply don't want to take a standardized test for your own belief system or your own values, that's okay. What we do recommend is that you make these decisions in conjunction with your academic advisor and with your college advisor, because with the insight that we gain to your experience, your goals, we can really help you figure out, is testing the right direction for you or is it not? We've had a lot of students in the last couple of years that have, you know, gone for it and started the test prep process with us and discovered through that process that it's probably not the best use of their time. And so they've pulled back, they've decided to apply test optional and put their focus elsewhere. But it's really important to do that early, right? So how do you set yourself up for success? As I was saying, you want to evaluate your goals early. Sit down with a college advisor, talk about the types of schools you want to go to or the types of programs you want to apply to as well. Right? We've noticed that testing tends to be more important in a process for an engineering applicant or a computer science or medicine type of applicant compared to an applicant who's applying for English literature or philosophy, right? So let's talk about your goals early. Let's talk about how important testing might be in your process. And then you really want to keep all doors open for as long as possible. So try testing. You don't know what you don't know until you try, right? So give it a chance, see if you can earn strong scores, because no matter where or what you're applying for, that will be helpful for you if you can get there. So give it a chance, keep that door open as long as you can. And then making decisions about submitting or not submitting on a school by school basis. For students that are applying to mostly test optional colleges, you have a choice. It is an option, right? So if your score is going to be strong in one applicant pool and maybe not so strong in another, then let's send it to this applicant pool and not to this one, because you actually do have that choice. And again, that's something that you can talk about with your college advisor to figure out, where does it make sense for you to send your test scores at the end of the day? And then lastly, above all, what we recommend, as Lindsay talked about a little bit earlier, is to focus most of your energy and your time on taking challenging courses, getting strong grades, and developing an interesting story through meaningful activities. Because at the end of the day, no matter which college you apply to in the US, these are the 3 things that are required for all of them. So just because we talk a lot about testing, because maybe you can do it here, maybe not, etc., these are the things that make up the core of your application. And ultimately, at the end of the day, these are the things that are most important. So make sure that, if it comes down to testing or not testing, you want to keep most of your time and energy for these 3 things instead. Anybody want to add anything else before we move on to the early start piece? Cool. Okay, Lindsay, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Olivia. So I just want to preface this by saying that I firmly believe that success in the college process is the culmination of lots of small decisions over time, most of which have probably already been made by the most part by the time our students reach 11th grade. And with that in mind, more and more I see parents, especially those with older children who've actually already been through this process, recognize that investing the time to make wiser choices earlier, like sometimes as early as 8th or 9th grade, can lay a stronger foundation for later. And I say this to parents all the time, but perhaps almost counterintuitively, starting early doesn't add stress. It actually does quite the opposite by allowing for proactive, intentional planning. And let me tell you why I feel this more so now than ever. So we're about a year out from the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, and with it, there has been and continues to be a renewed focus on what factors both do and should matter in the admissions process. Plus, we remain in, as Olivia and Gretchen just shared, a largely fluid test optional environment. And in this landscape, colleges continue to use holistic review, which includes many personal factors, such as language, geography, family background. And how do we know these things still matter, first of all? Well, the essay questions are kind of giveaways as they ask students to reflect on their unique backgrounds and experiences. Plus, in an evolving test optional landscape, storytelling remains paramount, sort of to the point Olivia was making before. What do we know that colleges are asking for? They want to know your story. And it takes time and it takes intent to build a meaningful narrative. We encourage students to follow their curiosity and to build organically. So, for example, one summer plan begets another summer, or an experience in school drives an out-of-school research opportunity or volunteering endeavor. And our advisors help students plan intentionally with an eye toward the essay questions that are going to be asked, because we know what's coming. So we really want to think about how to shape the high school trajectory with that sense in the back of our minds of what's going to be asked, so we're well prepared to answer. And so, while planning early definitively leads to a smoother, more thoughtful process for students, it also carries strategic benefit when it comes to applying to colleges. Now, I want to back up for a second and say that early decision has been around for a long time, and I'll remind any of you who are not familiar with this, but early decision is the application option where you pick one school, you apply early to that school, and you hear early. So apply around November 1, hear right around the holidays, and it's binding, meaning that you need to attend that school if you're accepted. An early decision, as I said, has been an option for some time. It's a strong sign of interest to the university where you choose to commit. And colleges value students who are eager to make a commitment, which often means higher acceptance rates in that early decision round. Now, we saw something very interesting at the University of Chicago this summer, and I suspect other colleges may follow suit. So I want to kind of call this out as a case study and perhaps an indicator of what's to come. So the University of Chicago rolled out what they call an early notification option. And this is an option exclusively for students who participate in their summer program. And what this means is that they're essentially creating another round of early decision, like an early round, where students who participate in this summer program get a first chance to submit a binding early decision application before anyone else does. So, okay, let's pause and think about this. Why does this matter? Well, the first thing is that it's actually a pretty meaningful disruption to our historical understanding of the impact of college summer programs and their bearing on admissions. We've long known that pre-college summer programs at selective schools have indicated strong interest, and they can build a student's profile by, demonstrating academic initiative, for example. But they have not, until now, had an explicit bearing on admissions, particularly not in individual schools. And we also know that elite colleges are always competing for the best students, and they want to increase their yield, or the number of students that say yes to their offer. So UChicago's now binding early program, as I refer to it, further contributes to this early funnel. And it's likely more schools will follow suit, trying to snatch up those students, which will only drive the earliness of the process overall when it comes to certainly submitting applications by the deadlines, but even planning for high school summers, which again can be even more impactful. All right. So with that, we will talk a little bit more about we'll sum up and just kind of talk about more about what to do with all of this information. So I want to reiterate some of the takeaways of this conversation so far. On the SAT and ACT front, as the landscape continues to shift, we really encourage students to start early, start sophomore year with diagnostics, begin to understand whether the evolving SAT or ACT is the better fit, hone in on that test, and then make a game plan to prepare with the option of submitting down the road or not. With that said, I just want to underscore again that testing is often additive, even when not required. So we're seeing requirements coming back. I doubt that they will universally come back, but nonetheless, testing can be an asset. So even more reason to start early and see whether that can be something to include as part of your profile. And as you are doing that, to just keep an eye on those policy updates from your colleges of interest, because this is a little slippery. Every year seems to be a bit different. So don't sleep on that, and just remain aware as you are visiting schools and building your list. And then I will reiterate again, just the value of an early start, not just on testing, but on the entire application narrative building. It takes years, not months, to truly create a story that comes from a place of genuine interest and engagement. And as the college application process itself shifts earlier and earlier, you really want to make sure you're prepared as a way of taking some of the inevitable stress and anxiety out of the process that's to come. Great.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lindsay. And thank you to Gretchen, and thank you to everyone who came to the webinar to talk today. We have plenty of time at the end here to talk about your questions. So for those of you that are still with us, we would love for you to put your questions in the Q&A box so that we can take a look at them and talk about them all together as a group. We did have a couple folks that sent in some questions ahead of time, so we're going to start with that. We did have one registrant who asked about the importance of English proficiency tests, like the TOEFL test or the Duolingo test, as far as testing requirements go. So those are very much a different side of testing, because obviously U.S. applicants do not need to submit any kind of English proficiency test. U.S. citizens who are living or studying abroad do not need to submit English proficiency tests. And actually quite a lot of international students, if you attend an American high school or a British school or a school in which you are largely speaking English, you may not need to complete one either, depending on the colleges you're applying to. So the testing requirements for that sort of thing are very different. And generally what colleges are looking for with an English proficiency exam is just, does the student meet the requirement we need to make sure their English is strong enough to succeed here? That's really all they're looking for. So those types of tests do not give any other indication of a student's ability or anything like that. It's really just focused on, do they speak, read, and write English well enough to be successful if they came to our university? So that's really what you're looking for when you are completing a Duolingo or TOEFL exam, is to make sure that you are hitting at least that minimum number that the college puts out. And ideally, what we recommend for our students is to try to go even a little bit above and beyond that. If you're looking at the highest, highest selectivity range of colleges and you're applying as an international student, you do want to be able to at least have 100 or so on the TOEFL. That's 100 out of 120. And then on the Duolingo test, we usually recommend aiming for at least 125 or 130 out of the total 160 that you can earn on the Duolingo exam. So those are the ranges that we recommend, but colleges also post their individual minimum requirements as well. Right. And I'm actually having trouble pulling up the Q&A box. So I don't know, Gretchen or Lindsay, if either of you are able to get it pulled up.
I'm not seeing
I think I
anything
have.
in the chat. Do you see anything,
Yeah.
Gretchen?
Nope, I have it open, but no questions.
Okay.
Did we really explain everything? I'm sure there's got to be some questions out there.
Well, I imagine many of you may have individual questions. I also know that some of these questions are highly specific. So please reach out. Contact at LogicPrep is kind of our main inbox. And then I'm just Lindsay at LogicPrep, Olivia at LogicPrep, and Gretchen, for any specific questions related to college or academics. We are here to help however we can.
Absolutely. I actually have a question that I think might be helpful for some folks. I have a question for Gretchen. When we're sitting down at this point with students that are looking at starting the test prep process soon, what are the kinds of things that you're going over with students to determine, should they plan for the SAT, should they plan for the ACT, or should they try both at this stage?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. As I sort of alluded to before, I like to get students to actually take an SAT and an ACT, a practice one with us, before we really make any decisions, because it could be that they perform way differently on the two of them. More often than not, students perform more or less in line on the two tests. They are, after all, trying to get at sort of the same thing, which is this big idea of college readiness. And so some of the things that we look at in terms or what makes the two tests different. And so does the student really have a strong preference for taking it on paper or on the digital format? That's something that we'll take into account if they're US based. Timing is a big thing. Timing is something that is a real big challenge on the ACT. It's a very speeded test. So not only is it long, but it crams a lot into the amount of time that you're taking the test. And so if the student, everyone struggles with the ACT timing on their diagnostic. I should, level set that. No one takes the ACT diagnostic and is like, oh, that timing was easy. But the degree to which the student struggles with timing on the ACT diagnostic will give us a little bit of a hint as to how big of a hurdle is that going to be to improve on that timing, which will get better. But, if you're running enough time for 5 questions versus if you're running enough time for 20 questions, that can say, all right, maybe ACT is an option, or maybe the SAT is actually a little bit better. As I was saying before, I actually did a little bit of research with our students that we've had this last cycle today, and I've got my notes here. If you're shooting for those tippy top schools, so the ones that are like kind of going back to requiring tests, and you want to get a 99 percentile score, so something of 1500 or above on the SAT or a 34 above on the ACT, unless you have a really, really strong preference for the SAT, I would encourage you to do the ACT. And just to put some actual numbers to what I was saying before about it being hard to break into that 1500 plus range, this is something that we've learned through the 3 test administrations that we've had so far in the US and gotten scores back from. We've had 32 students at LogicPrep in the US taking these tests in the spring, and for the SAT, and then about 34 taking the ACT. This is not a scientific study. I didn't say, okay, these students are the exact same level starting out. So of course there's there's a little bit of grain of salt that you've got to take with this, but about the same number of students taking each of the tests. For the SAT, we have 2 students that were able to get a 1500 or above, and 1 additional student who was able to do that on a super score. So 2 that got a 1500 on a single sitting, 1 additional one who got a super score. equivalent to a 1500 is around a 34 on an ACT. We had 9 students get a 34 on the ACT in these spring administrations, and 12 if you include the ones that were able to achieve that with a super score. So again, it's not a scientific study, but that's a pretty meaningful difference, 3 versus 12. So if you're really shooting for those tippy top scores, I know the SAT feels attractive, but I would really kind of encourage you to go with the ACT. And this is the conversation that I've been having with a lot of our students that have been starting out recently.
That's awesome. That's super helpful.
Thanks, Gretchen. I see 2 questions just came in sort of related to each other. So one person just asked, are strong academics a priority versus extracurriculars? And then I see, so if there's one thing we should focus on, would it be good grades and testing other than joining clubs, running projects, etc.? So let me kick this off, and Olivia, I'm sure you'll have something to add. But I would say, as sort of a baseline expectation, yes, strong academics are number one. Grades above all else. That's sort of a setting the stage component of this process. And it's only once students have kind of the baseline academic expectations that colleges really take into deeper consideration what else it is sort of subjectively that they can bring to the table. Now, that's not to say that an extremely strong artistic, athletic, general sort of extracurricular engagement can't sort of shift the balance a little bit. But I do think if you're trying to kind of organize yourself and your thinking, start with academics, everything builds from there.
Yeah, that's 100% right, Lindsay. I think the only thing I would add is just kind of a slightly different way of basically saying the same thing almost, is that the way I talk about it with my students is that colleges all have sort of a threshold of academic achievement that you have to hit in order to be in the conversation, right? So for example, in my experience as an admission person, like we would have an academic rating for an applicant. Basically, we would rate from 1 to 9, 9 being the highest, based on their transcript and their testing if they submitted it. Academically, how strong is this student? And then we would also apply a personal rating from 1 to 5, 5 being the highest. That's based around extracurriculars, recommendation letters, essays, just a kind of personal understanding of how interesting or compelling is this student. And the personal rating really only comes into play after a student has hit a certain threshold of the academic rating, right? So if a student was at a 5 or below on the academic rating, chances are they're not getting in. It doesn't matter how compelling they are personally, they really have to hit that threshold first, right? And every college is going to have a slightly different metric for what that threshold looks like, right? Harvard is going to have a very different idea of what that should look like than your local state university, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's really important to make sure, if you're shooting for colleges that are really selective, that at the very least you've hit that baseline academic threshold, because until you've hit that threshold, everything else you do doesn't matter. That being said, once you have hit that threshold, the everything else that you're doing is what actually gets you into the college, right? So your academics is what gets you into the conversation, so that the admission office is talking about your application and saying, oh, wow, we really like this student. We think they could fit here. And now all of those other things that you do, the extracurriculars, the volunteering, the projects, the building relationships with your school and with your counselors and everything, all of that is what's ultimately going to be able to get you the yes at the end of the day.
Yeah.
That's such a good way to put it, Olivia. And do you mind if I piggyback with like a question there? I remember my own experience in high school, and I imagine that this is the case for a lot of our students, that it felt like I wasn't doing enough. Like, okay, I'm doing this extracurricular, but I'm not doing all these other ones. I should be like doing 17 million of extracurriculars, like get all the clubs, get all the things. But I think based on what you guys were saying and what Lindsay's whole conversation was about narrative, it's much more important to have like fewer, deeper aligned things than it is to sort of demonstrate that you are checking a lot of boxes. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. We are big believers in quality over quantity. And so, you know, I think this like idea of a well-rounded student is somewhat of a myth. Some students are well-rounded, and if you are, like, that's awesome. Do a lot of things. But not everyone is, and that's okay. I think it's really about going deeply and investing in what it is that you care about, what it is that you love to do, and focusing on that rather than running in a million directions.
Absolutely. It's helpful to remember that at the end of the day, you only have 10 activity spots on
That's
your
true, right?
application, right? So if you're doing 20 or 30 different activities over the course of high school, you still only get to put 10 of those on your application. And you have
Right.
to be really mindful about which 10 you're going to choose. And so anytime that I sit down with a student that has a ton of activities, a big thing that we do is really talk through what are the most important things to you? What are the things that this college has to know about you and has to see about you in order to understand who you are and why they want you on their campus? And so you can even think that to yourself in 9th and 10th and 11th grade as you're trying to build your activities over the course of those years. Think to yourself about, you know, what's the most important thing to you? What are the things that are going to make that top 10 list? And then really invest in those things and really try to make those things shine over the course of high school.
Yeah, that's so funny. It is sort of like a, not to be too hyperbolic, but like a problem when students come in, they're like, I don't know what my 10 should be. I feel like that's a fairly common conversation. And like, we're like figuring out, well, like what takes precedence. And I've had students say like, well, can I use the additional information section and include my additional activities? And the answer is usually no. They're not asking for more unless there's something super compelling that needs to be further explained. You really want to kind of work within the structure of the application, and that structure dictates that we want to know 10 things you've done. So Olivia, thank you for bringing that up. That's a really good point.
And
Yeah, and I
even
think it goes back to
if you
planning
were,
too, right?
Yeah.
what
I'm
were you
sorry,
going to say,
Olivia.
Gretchen?
I was just gonna say it goes back to planning too and starting early. Like if you are thinking ahead as to what you might want to be doing, and like Olivia was saying, thinking about what are the 10 things that I'm going to want to highlight, you're not going to be wasting your time having 20 activities that you're then upset that you can't include all of them on your application.
Right. Although I will say when I talk to, you know, the families of 8th, 9th graders, I will really encourage those students to start broadly, like do more earlier with the
Mm,
intent of honing in later. Like, I
mm,
think that it's very hard to know freshman year kind of where to focus. Nobody knows, and nor should they really know at that point. And so it totally makes sense to pursue more earlier on. And a lot of those things will sort of drift into the background. They'll never make it to the Common App. And maybe like by the time the student is in 12th grade, they're not going to be thinking about it anymore. It'll be like a distant memory, but it's all part of the journey of getting to where that student needs to go.
Absolutely. Yeah, 9th grade is especially a really good time for exploration, to really get out there, try a lot of different things, dip your toe in, you know, try something new that you never thought you would like, and you might discover something that, you know, you always thought you were going to do this, and now all of a sudden you want to do something else, right? Be open to that kind of experience. But then with the purpose of then in 10th grade and 11th grade, starting to refine, starting to hone in on what these things are that are really catching you. Because ideally, especially if you're aiming for top colleges, you want to be in some kind of leadership position by 11th grade. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean, oh, you're the president of student council or you run a club or whatever. It can look a lot of different ways. So if you're not the type of leader that's like, I'm going to stand up in front of the room and lead a meeting or whatever, that's fine. Leadership can mean a lot of different things, but that is usually the goal by 11th grade, is to have some element of leadership, some element of initiative that you are taking to say, I want to learn this thing, I want to do this thing, so I'm going to do it. And that's usually what we want to see by that point. And in order to get to that point, you have to have already spent your time in 9th grade, in 10th grade, exploring and refining your interests in order to be prepared for that by 11th grade.